Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast, and the next step, and maybe the most exciting step in our journey to uncovering the history of the decoration of one of the most celebrated works of painting in the world, the Sistine Chapel. In the last episode, we looked at the patronage of the chapel under Pope Sixtus IV, who not only had the chapel rebuilt to emulate the lost Temple of Solomon, but hired all of the best-known masters of the 1480s to paint the chapel walls, among them Sandro Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Perugino, Luca Signorelli, and Cosimo Rosselli. The chapel was finished with a frescoed altarpiece of the Assumption of the Virgin by Perugino and a vault of stars for the ceiling, and thus was finished in 1483. Michelangelo's phase of this story does not come until several popes later, including the passing of the Borgia Pope Alexander VI. The pope in question now is Pope Julius II, that is Giuliano della Rovere, the nephew of Pope Sixtus IV, who by the time of his election to the papacy in 1503, and by this time, Julius was already an older man. He was elected cardinal when Sixtus was still in power in the 1480s, and we have to consider Julius as the inheritor of Sixtus's artistic endeavors. We often see Julius II discussed as a worldly pope, ambitious, extravagant in his art patronage, but also as a man who set about military conquest, and so he is often called the warrior pope. It was under Julius II that Michelangelo would paint the Sistine ceiling, and also that Raphael would paint the Vatican stanze, and that the plans would be set in place to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica with the help of the architect Bramante. Julius II was also keen on continuing to add to the urban infrastructure and the grandeur of Rome, the growth of Renaissance Rome, following in the footsteps of his predecessors, Nicholas V in the mid 1400s and his uncle Pope Sixtus IV. Now, at this time, we're in 1503, Michelangelo was already back in Florence working on the David, Big Dave as I like to call him. Michelangelo will have already had a reputation in Rome. Around 1497, he completed his Bacchus for Cardinal Riario, which was ultimately purchased by the banker Jacopo Galli. It was perhaps through this Bacchus commission that Michelangelo, while still in Rome in the late 1490s, had earned the commission to complete his famous Pietà, a superb work of art that shows the dead Christ in the lap of his mother Mary after the crucifixion. The subject matter of the Pietà is very much belonging to the tradition of Northern European art, which makes sense if we consider that the cardinal who commissioned the work was French. So we see Michelangelo take on the subject with his unique vigor and concept of pathos and heightened sense of compositional impact. Undoubtedly, to look at Michelangelo's Pietà alongside almost any other large-scale sculpture of the 1490s is to truly understand that anyone who looked upon it when it would have been seen as the highest level of skill and grace in sculptural mastery. So after the Pietà, Michelangelo was famous. And as the story goes, when the sculpture was the talk of the town, Michelangelo had overheard someone say it was done and completed by some master from Lombardy. So Offended to ensure such blemishes to his fame did not endure, Michelangelo returned to the work and carved his name on it along the sash of the Madonna, which reads in Latin, Michelangelo the Florentine made it. In 1505, being familiar with Michelangelo's work in Rome and now the fame of the recently finished giant David, at last Pope Julius II called Michelangelo back to Rome to begin what would be Michelangelo's first, but certainly not his last, papal commission. It began, as you might expect, not a fresco, a major sculptural commission. The Pope first commissioned Michelangelo to design and carve his tomb. Renaissance people. This to me is one of the great losses to art history. This was going to be a monumental mausoleum, four-sided. It would have had at least 40 complete life-size statues by Michelangelo as representations of the liberal arts, the virtues, and other allegorical figures. Those that he completed that we still have or left incomplete, we refer to as the slaves or the prisoners, but they would have been these virtues or these liberal arts. Michelangelo went immediately to Carrara to oversee the quarrying of the marble, which would have taken about 8 months to get it chosen, carved, and back to Rome to begin his work on the tomb. He worked on the tomb. He roughly carved some of the figures. Some he brought to near completion or to completion. Now, these are those unfinished figures that you see if you go to the Accademia in Florence to see David and the truly near complete sculptures by Michelangelo that are inside the Louvre today in Paris. Some of the works, including his finished Moses, do indeed decorate Julius's tomb today, which instead of the four-sided monumental mausoleum inside of the new St. Peter's, it's a single-sided but still magnificent work inside this church of San Pietro in Vincoli. So be sure to add this as a stop to your Rome itinerary to visit Michelangelo's work on the tomb of Julius II. So the tomb, as Michelangelo hoped it would be, a lifelong project that would keep him employed, sculpting, it abruptly ended in 1506 when Julius canceled the commission. Why did he do that? Perhaps the Pope reevaluated the vanity of this project, the cost, the time working with Michelangelo. We do not know. Michelangelo himself laments that it was his rival Bramante who convinced the Pope to cancel it, wanting the funds redirected for the rebuilding of St. Peter's, and so continuing to employ Bramante for grand, expensive projects. Ultimately, it doesn't matter why the Pope canceled the Tomb Commission, he did, and Michelangelo was furious. And to make matters worse, he was denied payment for some of the materials he paid for himself up front, and so he left Rome in a rage. He remained in Florence for several months, licking the wounds of his lost commission, before reconvening with the Pope in Bologna after Julius had reconquered the city. There is a fun bit of history in between here that occurred in Bologna where Michelangelo did complete a now destroyed bronze statue of Pope Julius as conqueror of Bologna, but in the end, Michelangelo ended up returning to Rome where the task of painting the Sistine ceiling came to the forefront of their relationship. I'm going to read for you now Michelangelo's own take on this circumstance, which he tells through his biographer Ascanio Condivi. I want to stress that this is his own idea of what transpired, not historical fact, and it treats the idea already that Raphael was at this point seen as a superior painter. So, reading from Condivi's Life of Michelangelo, Michelangelo came on to Rome where Pope Julius, still resolved not to do the tomb, was anxious to employ him. Then Bramante and other rivals of Michelangelo put it into the Pope's head that he should have Michelangelo paint the vault of the chapel of Pope Sixtus IV. And they were doing this service with malice in order to distract the Pope from projects of sculpture, and because they took it for certain that either he would turn the Pope against him by not accepting an undertaking, or if he accepted, he would prove considerably inferior to Raphael of Urbino, who they plied with every favor out of hatred for Michelangelo, and it was their opinion that Michelangelo's principal art was the making of statues. Michelangelo, who had not yet used colors and who realized that it was difficult to paint a vault, made every effort to get out of it, posing Raphael and pleading that this was not his art and that he would not succeed, and he went on refusing to such an extent that the Pope almost lost his temper. But when he saw that the Pope was determined, he embarked on that work which is to be seen today in the papal palace to the admiration and amazement of the world, and which brought him so great a reputation that it set him above all envy. End quote. Now, there are some lies here, especially that Michelangelo claims he was not an experienced painter. In the very same biography by Condivi, he denies his apprenticeship to Ghirlandaio, where in fact he was an apprentice and learned to fresco in the workshop of Ghirlandaio as an adolescent. So he already knew how to fresco, and he is saying, I didn't even know how to paint. There's no way you painted the Sistine Chapel and did not know how to paint. The Pope had some simple ideas for the decoration scheme of the ceiling. However, it seems that the tension between Julius II and Michelangelo created a type of situation that is very rare at this point in history. Michelangelo wanted to take over some of the creative development of the chapel, if not all of it, essentially refuting Julius's concept and proposing a new one that was far more ambitious and one that Julius accepted. What was devised was to fill the ceiling with a logical narrative and symbolic flow that enhanced the already frescoed walls. That is, those 1480s paintings on the side walls that tell the life of Moses and the other that tell the life of Christ. The ceiling would then unify them as scenes from the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, which includes the stories of creation and the stories of Noah. Where previously the Sistine Chapel connected the divinely ordained law of Moses of the Old Testament through the new laws of Christ and the legendary founding of the papacy by St. Peter, now Michelangelo would see the trajectory go further back to the seed of divine creation itself, which may, frankly, have more to do with what Michelangelo saw of himself and his role on the ceiling than what he wanted to project for the Pope. What I mean by that is that the creation account in Genesis perfectly embodies the ideas of philosophy, of the emerging sense of the artist as self determined, as a divinely inspired creative individual, which does not exclusively begin with Michelangelo, but we know he was part of the moment in Western art history where the creative genius of the artist was emerging from underneath the centuries of being under the social class of craftsman or laborer. We can consider all of the factors of these social circumstances alongside his antagonistic relationship with the Pope and his rejection and elaboration of the Pope's original concept as a means to suppose that the devout Michelangelo certainly saw his work as a testament to himself, not of Pope Julius II. And so now Michelangelo will set about painting the ceiling. The year is 1508, the same time in which Raphael begins his Vatican frescoes, so they are contemporary. Looking at the ceiling in chronological order, not the order it was painted.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, do you want more content and maybe to help support this show? Join me on Patreon for exclusive podcast episodes, Or if you want a visual experience, you can enroll in my Udemy course, which teaches the Florentine Renaissance and includes nearly 12 hours of art history lectures. You can also find podcast merch on our Etsy. You'll find links to all of these in the show notes. I want to thank you all sincerely for listening. Now, back to the show. It is organized in three triads showing the phases of creation. The first triad begins with the separation of light and dark, the creation of the sun, moon, and planets, and beyond that, the creation of the waters, showing God Himself, God the Father, dressed in a pink gown, creating these things: light, dark, sun, moon, planets, water. Without a doubt, the most famous of the frescoes of this cycle is what begins the second triad, Michelangelo's creation of Adam, which I will discuss in the end of this episode, followed by the creation of Eve, the temptation and expulsion from paradise. Then there is the last triad, the three scenes of Noah. First, the sacrifice, then the deluge, or the great flood, Noah's ark, and finally, the drunkenness of Noah, where Noah discovers that fermented grapes become wine. He gets drunk, passes out nude, is seen by his family, which produces the rift in the family line, but is also a central discovery in the mythology of winemaking for Italy, but also the Eucharist, foreshadowing Christ. He almost certainly began with this work, with the drunkenness of Noah, which is the last in the sequence, but the first that he painted. And that could account for why it's difficult to read the figures in the first triad, who seem to gradually get larger and more legible after it is completed. To dispel some of the stories, the ceiling was not done with him laying on his back. He painted it standing and complained immensely about the discomfort, pain, the pigments falling into his eyes, and all of what you can expect of such a miserable task. The scaffolding covered one half of the chapel, and once it was completed, it was moved to the second half of the chapel, all quite logistically sound. The earliest part of the work almost certainly was done with assistance, especially the cartoons and putting them on the walls for the fresco, including the painter and Michelangelo's friend Francesco Granacci, who was also an apprentice to Ghirlandaio, although it seems that Michelangelo grew quite fed up with the assistants and dismissed them, working on the chapel in isolation. I personally do not think this means he did not have help. It is certainly likely that he still had assistants grinding and making pigments, preparing the what is called intonaco, which is the layer of wet plaster that gets applied to paint the frescoes, and things of this nature, practical assistance. But he was very secretive. He didn't let people into the chapel, and it appears that it may be that he truly did the painting by himself, even with his frustration of the Pope checking in frequently and climbing the scaffolding. In addition to those ceiling scenes, the sides and the vaults above the 1480 frescoes are covered with the most exemplary figures of the prophets and the sibyls. Sibyls being pagan era prophets who were believed to foreshadow Christ, much like Old Testament prophets. So, among the sibyls, for example, we see the Delphic sibyl, who represents the famous oracle of Delphi, the priestess to the god Apollo. In the lunettes, which are those rounded arch parts of the vaults, he paints the genealogy of Christ. He covers every inch of surface with storytelling and symbols, including Florentine favorites like David and Goliath and Judith and Holofernes, and others like the brazen serpent, the story of Jonah, who's consumed by a large fish. And among the most superb of his figures, and truly the figures that wholly changed anatomical representation in Renaissance painting, are his ignudi. Ignudi. These are the figures that you see floating about everywhere, who simply serve as anatomical decorative functions. They are in every impossible pose imaginable. And this is the crux of the innovation that we see on the Sistine ceiling. Giorgio Vasari, that biographer of artists, contemporary of Michelangelo, puts the history of Italian artists into three phases. The third and final phase, he says, is initiated by Leonardo da Vinci, perfected by Michelangelo. Very important is that Vasari claims that this third phase of artist does not only rival the art of the ancients, which we've said over and over again is the Renaissance, the revival of classical antiquity, but this third generation of artists surpasses the ancients. And how does Vasari say this is done? By the exact method that Michelangelo constructs the figures on the Sistine ceiling. Vasari says, quote, "And then the most beautiful style comes from constantly copying the most beautiful things, combining the most beautiful hands, heads, bodies, or legs together to create from all of these beautiful qualities the most perfect figure possible, and using it as a model for all the figures in each of one's works. And on account of this, it is said to be a beautiful style." End quote. Working in the Vatican, Michelangelo also had access to some of the period's most prized discoveries of ancient Roman art, which accounts for these parts combined to make a perfect whole. And many of these ancient Roman sculptures are copies of known ancient Greek arts. For example, the Belvedere torso, the Laocoon group, discovered in 1506, evaluated by Michelangelo himself, or the Apollo Belvedere, dug up in the 1480s, and many more ancient sculptures. Taking Vasari's analysis, the Ignudi and other ceiling figures are compositions of all the best parts of each of these many ancient statues that Michelangelo was studying and drawing and composing new forms with, so that the anatomy and the grace of the figures are seen as perfection when combined rather than wholes with perfect parts. It is what enables their almost abstract anatomies, twisting and turning in unnatural ways that appear believable and delicate, but are highly improbable. To focus on one last thing to talk about, the creation of Adam, that central artwork of the second triad of the book of Genesis in the center of the Sistine ceiling, worth every ounce of its fame. We do not see the Adam created from earth itself, from dust, but instead we see that Michelangelo conceives creation of the first man as the moment of intellect being passed to him by God, not physicality. It is that critical moment. Their hands, those famous hands, they reach out towards each other. God's reach is much more fervent, and Adam is reaching as if he's new to having hands. He doesn't know what to do with them. He is a body. Perhaps we should say a soulless one, his gaze almost yearning for the gift of the soul that God is bringing to him. And he sits reclined. His torso and thigh muscles are directly copied from the Belvedere torso of Hercules, bent in tension, in flexing, in musculature. And his profile of his face should be seen like a Mercury, like an Apollo. His arms are long, and every muscle is in tension and exact. Each limb is sketched from a different classical example. But do we really sit like this? Try it right now if you're not driving and listening. Try it. Look at the creation of Adam and recline like that. Have a lay, give it a go. It doesn't work. It's uncomfortable. It's unnatural, right? But this combined harmony of perfect parts or perfect original composition of form has indeed surpassed what the ancients were creating, according to Vasari. Adam reaches out. His wrist is somewhat limp, as if he cannot quite lift it to touch the finger of God himself. This gift must be given to him. And if we follow God's arm, that engaged hand, that long finger reaching to touch Adam's, follow the arm up to his shoulder, his beard bellowing as if his motion is fervent, and down his other arm, which drapes over the shoulder of the nude soul of probably the future Virgin Mary, his hand falling on the soul of his and her Son, Christ, who is himself God, who will become man, who looks out on us, looking up at him. Tying all of this together, making the story of Genesis an uncounted precursor to Christ, where the bliss of initial creation, which we know is doomed to fall, will be recovered by the coming of Christ through the miraculous conception and virgin birth of Mary. And as it has been said before, Michelangelo had ample practice in anatomical study and dissection, and it is no accident whatsoever that God certainly is in what appears to be the anatomical cross-section of a human brain. Michelangelo is linking the mind, the intellect, and the gift of the soul as a parallel to his own sense of divine creation in his painting of the Sistine Chapel. Renaissance people, this was an intimidating beast to tackle in this format, and I hope I was able to do this exceptional work of art any kind of minute justice. All of this was happening during the painting of the Vatican Stanze by Raphael, and Michelangelo would be called back in the following decades to repaint the high altar, his last judgment. So, we're going to finish our discussion of the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo in the next episode. And then after, we'll step back in time, back to 1508, to talk about Raphael's stanze. Thank you all for tuning in, and until next time, arrivederci.